So thanks everyone for joining us today. Today's webinar will be presented by Vanessa Cullen with Delaware State Housing Authority. But before we jump into the webinar itself, I have a couple housekeeping things that I'd like to go over. First of all, our webinar today is provided for you by the Delaware National Estuarine Research Reserve. Our reserve is managed by DNREC's Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy and is part of a national network of reserves funded by NOAA. My name is Lynn Pusey, and I'm the Training and Engagement Coordinator for the Reserve's Coastal Training Program. Today's webinar with Vanessa is titled Mitigation and Resiliency in Disaster Housing. Some housekeeping things to go through. If you are interested in subtitles during today's presentation, you can do so using the icon at the bottom of your screen with the CC and the label Show Captions. All participants are muted for this webinar. If you have questions during the presentation, please place those in the chat box. We will not be raising hands for verbal questions today, but I'll be monitoring the chat and we'll go through the questions at the end of the presentation. I think we might have a spot in the middle too where we might break for questions also. Today's webinar is being recorded. A copy of that recording will be made available to you afterwards, and it will be placed on our Coastal Training Program website. Okay, so today's webinar presented by Vanessa Cullen with Delaware State Housing Authority. She is the Emergency Management Coordinator. Thank you, Vanessa, for being with us today. I'm going to let Vanessa do a quick introduction. We're going to do a quick poll, and then we'll jump right in.
Thank you for having me. I'm sure you saw the title page, but today we're going to be talking about mitigation and resiliency and how they intersect with disaster housing. Real quick, I figure everyone is familiar with mitigation and resiliency, like those terms, everyone is here, but I don't know how familiar everyone is with disaster housing as a term. So the poll that Lynn referenced is just going to be like a quick ask to see what you think the definition is. And there's not a right or wrong answer. We'll go over it. I just want to make sure we're all like on the same starting point and kind of test the knowledge of the room. So if everyone could take like 30 seconds, write down what you think it is, and then we'll go.
Looks like the responses have slowed down. What do you think, Vanessa?
I think we're good.
Okay, great. I'm going to end the poll.
Thank you.
So I'm going to pull that over here so we can see a little better. So things that folks are thinking with disaster housing: an immediacy to it, emergency, supplemental, individuals, temporary housing, disaster, residents, long-term, whose shelter, weather, displaced, needed for sure, damage. There's a lot of really good stuff in here.
Yeah, and it was like not a trick question. Thank you for doing the poll, Lynn. That's really helpful.
Sure thing. I'm going to
So
stop
I'm going to
sharing
share
now.
my screen and I'll take it from there. Okay, so like I was saying, not a trick question. Disaster housing is exactly what it sounds like. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, thank you.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it's just providing housing to people that have been displaced due to some kind of catastrophic event. So disaster housing is very collaborative. There's not a single agency that's responsible for having those houses ahead of time or for coordinating the movement of people, for the intake, for the support services. It takes state and local jurisdictions, nonprofits, community organizations, private orgs, sometimes the federal government, and it requires policies and procedures that enable housing recovery to be safe, efficient, and equitable, affordable. I'm sure you can imagine that having affordable housing is especially important after a disaster. That's not a time where people have extra funds to spend, and we want that housing to be resilient. So lastly, disaster housing is fundamental to disaster recovery, and we will get more into that later. Real quick, on this screen, I mentioned like these three phases where we talk about shelters, temporary housing, and permanent housing. And let's go more in order of what those each consist of. So let's start before the disaster. That's like the preparedness phase. And preparedness activities occur again, prior to a disaster, and that can include like response and recovery planning activities, mitigation planning and implementation, community capacity building, partnership development, or regular blue sky day activities like new housing development, housing rehabilitation projects, things like that. Then a disaster hits, people are displaced, housing is affected, people can't live there anymore. And really quickly, the day of, the days after, people need to be put into sheltering. That's a short-term solution to a long-term problem. Sometimes people have friends or family that they can stay with, but for those who don't, in Delaware, it's the Department of Health and Social Services that sets up sheltering for individuals in need of a place to stay. So while sheltering typically is 2 weeks or less in Delaware, it can take a lot longer than 2 weeks for your permanent housing to get repaired or to find a new place to live, especially with the housing shortage that we're in. So sometimes between sheltering and getting back into your normal house, you need interim housing assistance. So interim housing is defined as housing that disaster survivors can occupy in the time between leaving a shelter and returning back to their home. So interim housing can include hotels, motels, rental units, manufactured homes, RVs, or again, staying with friends and family. Really any kind of creative, safe solution. Interim housing can include residents sheltering in place in their own house while that house is being repaired. And it should provide a level of privacy that you wouldn't expect to find in shelters, but it might not be an appropriate level of privacy for permanent housing or include the same level of amenities. And then that takes us to permanent housing, which is like the goal in this continuum. So that can take up to a couple of years. And I think that sounds longer than what people expect. But depending on the scale and the damage caused by the disaster and the availability of housing prior to a disaster, it could be years before people are fully back into permanent housing. So availability is dependent upon the individual or household needs and access to financial supports. Permanent housing solutions include housing repair or rehabilitation, lease or purchasing of housing, modular or manufactured homes, or permanent new construction. And then I think you can see there's like an arrow here. And this is a continuum. So after long-term permanent housing, we like cycle back into the preparedness phase. So doing that, elements of long-term recovery are also preparedness strategies, like post-disaster rebuilding provides an opportunity to incorporate updated building, updated land use standards, and to increase future resilience. So the permanent housing phase eventually cycles back into the preparedness phase. And hopefully in the preparedness phase, we are including strategies that help reduce future disaster impacts. So housing is one component of emergency management or of the recovery phase in emergency management. But if we just take a quick step back and look at the big picture, I just wanted to put this on the presentation to make sure that everyone was familiar with like the general phases of emergency management. And you'll see that there's a lot of similarity between the housing recovery continuum phases and the emergency management phases. It's just that the former are more specific because they're only through a housing lens, and this is through like the entire process and all the things that are affected. So real quick, we have the preparedness phase, which is getting ready for a disaster. That's organizing, training, equipping, exercising, all those things that you can do pre-disaster. Response is any kind of life-saving or property-saving events. That's your search and rescue, medical care, firefighting, sheltering, things of that nature. Then you move into recovery down here. So with housing, recovery is rebuilding, but recovery begins immediately after the threat to human life has subsided. So The goal of the recovery phase is to get everything back to how it was pre-disaster. So you want to be back to like a state of normalcy. So typical recovery actions include debris cleanup, financial assistance to individuals or to governments, rebuilding roads, bridges, other infrastructure, and sustained mass care for displaced people and animals. Um, Recovery is often broken down into these pillars called recovery support functions, and housing is one of those functions. So recovery as a whole is greater than housing, but housing is obviously coming from the State Housing Authority, my focus. So real quick, this is a lot. I don't expect everyone to read this right now. We can share it out afterwards, but I just wanted to overlay the phases between the housing recovery continuum and the emergency management cycle. So you can see they both have preparedness, then the disaster hits, they both have response. There's like short-term and long-term housing or recovery, which, the long-term housing goes in long-term recovery, interim housing goes in short-term recovery. And then once things are back to steady state operations, you're kind of going back to your mitigation, prevention, planning, preparedness, and it circles again. This is where I wanted to pause just to see if I lost anybody with any of the fundamentals before moving on to my work specifically. So does anyone have any questions about any of the phases or disaster housing as a whole?
Any questions, just as a reminder, feel free to drop those in the chat. Everybody's muted for the webinar itself, but during the entire webinar, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on that.
Okay, I'm going to just keep moving forward then. All right, so the crux of my work is centralized to this disaster housing strategy. The strategy is new. It was just published last June, and it was a collaborative effort. It provides like a operational framework for local governments or stakeholders in Delaware. So it's not for the homeowner themselves, it's for the entities or organizations that would support the homeowner. But it's like a guide to Delaware's disaster housing preparedness and recovery efforts. So the goal is to ensure that displaced residents can access secure housing quickly and equitably after a disaster. In the strategy, it's very like reader friendly, right? So we kind of wanted to build the language, make sure we have a common operating picture for anybody that picks it up. Not everybody is familiar with disaster housing. Even those who naturally have a nexus to housing in their day job, they don't always see it through an emergency management lens. So what you're doing day to day might be helping during the recovery process and you don't even realize it. So we tried to make this where people of all walks of life can pick it up and understand what their role is, what the phases are. So it's meant to be easy. But we included like the state demographics and the housing stock landscape. We went through each of those phases that we already talked about today, defined them, talked about stakeholders involved, the timeline for each, activities that happen under each, and how to transition from one phase to the next phase. We have pre-disaster capacity building recommendations, which is a mouthful, but I do love that section. This is where we focus on things that can be done, activities that can be done before a disaster that can significantly mitigate the impacts of disasters and enhance a community's ability to quickly respond and recover. So, for example, some households have deferred maintenance or things they don't address, right? They need a new roof, but they don't get the new roof due to cost, due to time, due to physical lack of capability. But when a storm comes along, issues will be worse for that homeowner because of the deferred maintenance. So a preparedness example would be to address deferred maintenance at the community level, right? So things like that. So we have pre-disaster capacity building recommendations in the strategy. And lastly, we have as complete of a list of resources as we can. So this is a living document. As we get new funding streams, as resources get depleted, as we build new partnerships, they'll get added to the strategy. But this is meant to be like a single document for people to turn to when they're trying to help communities get back on their feet after a disaster. Housing specific, of course. So within the strategy, we have goals. For the sake of this, we do not need to go through all of them. But goal number 3 is to enhance resilience and sustainability in housing reconstruction. And then within the goals are objectives. So the objectives here, there are 5, but only 2 are really important, I think. So the first is integrating resilience and sustainability standards into the planning and construction of new permanent housing to withstand future disasters. So if we understand the work that we do now will affect rebuilding later and lessen how much we have to rebuild later, then we can learn to better prepare current projects for future likelihoods. And that will give us ultimately a more resilient community that can better withstand and adapt to hazards that we're exposed to. And objective 3.2 is to provide education and resources to homeowners and developers alike on resilient construction practices and materials. So part of understanding what we need to do now is through education. So whether it's DSHA, DNREC, RASCL, Sea Grant, whoever the partner is, anyone can provide residents with information and resources that build upon this philosophy. And hopefully, ultimately, Delaware will be more prone to tackle development or construction projects through a resilience lens. Which brings us to our first takeaway. So the number one thing I'd like you guys to walk away with today is that mitigation and resiliency efforts facilitate an easier post-disaster recovery. So resilient housing or infrastructure, communities, doesn't have to just be housing, but as long as they're designed to withstand hazards like floods or storms or climate change impacts, let's see, or housing, sorry, I like messed up my sentence here. So resilient housing or infrastructure, or housing in communities that have utilized mitigation techniques to lessen the damage of these hazards are better off in the long run. And that's for a bunch of reasons, like more lives will be saved. We're lessening mental health impacts. We're minimizing economic impacts. We're minimizing additional living expenses. So rent, extra transportation because you're not living in the community you're in, things like that. We're lessening the cost of community services due to damaged buildings. For instance, if a fire station or hospital is damaged, you're not going to get the services from that fire station or hospital. And ultimately, you're speeding up the recovery process as a whole. So fun fact, I know earlier we talked about how long-term recovery can really be. So pending the size and scope of a disaster, the recovery process can take years to decades. So 2 quick examples of this are Hurricane Ida. I'm not sure if anyone here was personally impacted by that, but we had the flooding in Wilmington back in 2021. And 3 years later, we still had people in hotels from that disaster. So, and that was something that did not warrant federal assistance, at least not for housing. And another example was Hurricane Katrina, which is back in 2005. There was a hospital there, the University Medical Center of New Orleans, and it took a decade for it to reopen. So just to give some examples of the timeline we're talking about. Investing in resilient design and adaptive housing and infrastructure can support sustainable development and foster resilient communities. So pre-disaster education is a tool that should be utilized. Homeowners and developers alike can't be expected to incorporate resiliency measures into their homes or their building if they're not aware of the benefits. And the only benefit we didn't talk about is here. It pays to be prepared. So not only is the recovery shortened and there are less barriers if you implement mitigation techniques prior to a disaster, but you literally save money. So it was the National Institute of Building Sciences that did the study in 2019. And they found overall that every dollar spent on mitigation efforts saves $6 in the recovery phase. So it's literally cost effective to utilize mitigation and resiliency efforts when developing, when upgrading your house. So just something to keep in mind. It does pay to be prepared. And lastly, I hope this isn't blurry for you. These are those recovery support functions. So these are those pillars that I mentioned earlier in the recovery phase, of which housing is only one. So recovery is more than housing. It's economic, it's infrastructure repairs, it's cultural and ecological salvaging, mental health and physical health care, it's community capacity building, but it's also housing. And housing is a cornerstone of recovery because it enables people to return to work, to access education, to maintain social networks. It allows children to go to their school, families to stay close to their support networks. It provides homeowners and renters alike with a place to both be safe and keep their possessions safe. So while disasters will destroy homes and businesses, economic recovery stalls without safe housing. So I think there are a couple things here that obviously the work would be simultaneously addressed, but housing is really the cornerstone of recovery. And that's all I have for you today. Does anybody have any questions?
Thanks, Vanessa.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to, so I did put in the chat the link to the disaster housing preparedness strategy. So the document itself, I put that in the chat, but
Thank
I'm
you.
also going to drop a link for the website that it's housed on,
Mhm.
because that also has some good initiatives and information on disaster housing in Delaware. I don't see anything in the chat at the moment, but I did have a few follow-up questions for you, if you don't
Sure.
mind.
Not at all.
So first of all, I love the prepare now to be ready later mantra. I think that that's exactly what we should be doing for so many things.
Mhm.
So I love that. Um, I wanted to just clarify who your target audience is for the disaster housing preparedness strategy, like for that guide, that document.
Mhm.
So if we were to share this out, who is it that you were hoping is going to read it and use what's in it?
So when we wrote the strategy, we actually added a blurb saying like who the intended audience is. Just for clarification, because while it's publicly posted and anybody is welcome to read it, it's not going to help me as a homeowner on my own. So it's meant to assist state and local government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and community groups coordinate with one another so they know who is responsible for what resource, how to get in touch with that person, when they'll be up in that timeline, how long each of those phases takes to give people an idea of like how long their services might be needed or when they'll be needed, um, things
It's really
like
helpful
that.
information.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you. That does help clarify that a lot.
Mhm.
And then another question. If a community wanted to develop their own disaster housing plan, who should they reach out to if they have questions beyond what's in that strategy document?
So I feel like a lot of creating a plan is like community engagement. Um, I think it's important to identify the needs specific to your community, the strengths, what your gaps are, what you know is a problem. And there are some things that'll affect some communities in Delaware and not others. So I think once people have an understanding of exactly what their landscape is, then they could reach out to DEMA. I know Nikki Testa is on this call. I think DEMA could be a resource. I could be a resource. I work with a firm called Civics, and they're fantastic. So depending on, if they have money to pay a contractor, I think there are a lot of really well equipped contractors out there that can pull up like case studies or what other places have done, legislation examples, things like that, just to help localities understand what's within their power to do ahead of time. But I'm definitely a resource. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. That helps to know also. Um, we are just about at time. So I really appreciate your time today, Vanessa. I appreciate you answering my questions. And I would like to, um, I have some closing things that I just want to touch base with folks on. But if you have any final questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that. But all the resources and the links that we put in the chat today, they will be emailed out to all of our webinar participants today. So you will receive a follow-up email that will include a link for the recording of the webinar, and also any additional resources that we are able to send you. Our next Top 3 in 30 webinar will be Thursday, June 18th at 2 p.m. And for that one, we'll be learning about reforestation for green spaces. I'm really excited about that one too. If you are interested in upcoming webinars, I'm going to put that link in the chat as well. And then the final thing for your chat today is a survey link. Because this is really helpful in helping us to determine what topics to bring into these webinars in the future, and to see kind of what's working and things that we could work on. So if you could take just a moment I didn't hit send on that. There you go. If you could take just a moment to open that up, it's like 3 questions. Tell us how we did. Give us some ideas for things you'd like to learn about in the future. And so with that, that's our webinar for today. I don't see any follow-up questions. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, Vanessa, and everyone enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks all. Thanks, Lynn.